Café Jean, Madrid. Rain lashed against the windows as Carmen Mendoza, the billionaire CEO of Mendoza Tech, watched the man in the waiter's apron set down her café con leche. Diego Herrera, a single father, a janitor by day and a waiter by night to support his daughter, Lucia. He didn't know Carmen had been watching him for weeks. He didn't know her stalker ex-husband was outside the café. But when she grabbed his hand and whispered, "Please, pretend to love me for 10 minutes, or I'm dead," Diego did something that stunned everyone. He didn't pretend. He kissed this stranger as if her life depended on it, because in her eyes he recognized the same terror he'd seen in his wife's before she died. And those 10 minutes changed two broken lives forever. The Café Jean on Calle de Recoletos exuded that decadent elegance only Madrid can keep alive. Art Deco mirrors infinitely reflected the bohemian crystal chandeliers, while the white marble tables held the secrets of a century of literary gatherings and political conspiracies. The November rain pounded the windows with Mediterranean fury, transforming the lights of the Gran Via into watercolor smudges of neon and nostalgia. Diego Herrera had started his second shift at 6 p.m. after 8 hours cleaning offices at Mendoza Tech in the Four Towers. His knees throbbed from hours spent on them scrubbing black granite floors, his hands cracked and red from the industrial bleach used in the bathrooms. The waiter's apron hid the shirt with its worn cuffs, the only presentable one he owned, washed each night in the shared laundry of his Vallecas apartment. In his worn-out wallet, he kept a photo of Lucia, 9 years old with brown curls and eyes that had matured too soon. At that hour, she was with Mrs. Dolores, the neighbor on the third floor, who watched her for €15 a night, money Diego scraped together from tips on 2 good tables. Lucia would have had dinner by now, macaroni with tomato sauce, always macaroni because it was cheap and filling. She'd be doing her homework at the wobbly kitchen table, using her phone's light when the power went out, a frequent occurrence in their government-subsidized housing block. Carmen Mendoza had entered the café at exactly 8:30 p.m. as she had every Tuesday for a month. Diego had noticed her from the first night, not because he recognized her, though half of Madrid knew the face of the youngest and most ruthless CEO in Spanish tech, but because of the way she occupied space. She didn't walk, she glided, she didn't sit down, she alighted like an exotic bird that might take flight at any moment. Always the same ritual, the corner table by the window, from where she could watch who came and went. A café con leche she sipped for exactly an hour, a croissant she picked apart with pianist's fingers but never tasted, her iPad always on with stock charts flowing like digital rivers of euros. But tonight, Diego sensed something different in her behavior, the almost imperceptible trembling of her hands as she pretended to concentrate on the screen. The way her body tensed every time the door opened, like a deer scenting a hunter. The honey-colored eyes that nervously darted toward the entrance every 30 seconds with obsessive precision. Diego had learned to read people through years of professional invisibility. When you clean or serve, you become part of the furniture. People forget you have eyes and ears. They reveal secrets they wouldn't confess to a priest. He'd seen affairs begin over a coffee, €1 million deals closed between bites of tortilla española, lives destroyed with the same indifference as ordering another beer. He was approaching Carmen's table, tray perfectly balanced, years of practice had taught him not to spill a drop even at a run, when the café door opened with excessive violence for this temple of Madrilenian elegance. The man who entered looked like he'd stepped from the glossy pages of a luxury magazine. 190 centimeters of arrogance wrapped in a custom-tailored suit from Calle Serrano that probably cost what Diego earned in a year. Rodrigo Salazar, heir to the Salazar real estate empire, ex-husband of Carmen Mendoza. Diego knew the story, all Madrid did. The divorce had been tabloid headlines for months. She, the entrepreneur who'd built a tech empire from nothing. He, daddy's spoiled boy who'd married her when she was nobody and systematically cheated on her when she became somebody. The gossip press had spoken of infidelities, public humiliations at the country club, even violence that was never reported. Carmen had given up everything to escape that marriage, preferring freedom to the millions she was entitled to. Rodrigo sat at the table opposite Carmen without waiting for an invitation. The smile he gave her was that of a matador who knows the bull is exhausted and the kill is imminent. Diego saw terror explode in her eyes like silent fireworks. It was the same exact terror he'd seen in Elena's eyes, his wife, when the oncologist at Hospital 12 de Octubre had delivered the sentence, 3 months to live, maybe 4 with aggressive chemotherapy. He was setting down the café con leche when it happened. Carmen grabbed his wrist with a strength you wouldn't expect from those surgeons' hands. She pulled him toward her with the desperation of a drowning person clutching at anything that floats. The words came out in a whisper only Diego could hear, urgent as a racing heartbeat. Please, pretend you love me for 10 minutes. He's outside. If he sees me with someone, please. 10 minutes, then you can go. Another man might have hesitated, weighed the risks, asked for explanations, considered consequences. Diego didn't. Because in that moment, he didn't see the billionaire CEO. He saw Elena, silently asking for help she couldn't voice. He saw every woman he'd served in the cafe with bruises poorly concealed by makeup. He saw Lucia in 20 years, if the world didn't change, if men like Rodrigo continued to exist with impunity. The kiss that followed shook Café Jajan to its century-old foundations. Diego set the tray on a nearby table with studied calm. Then he leaned over Carmen and kissed her like a man who'd loved her for a lifetime. It wasn't a timid or hesitant kiss. It was pure passion, the kind you only see in Almodovar films. Diego's hand settled on the nape of her neck, sinking into that black hair that smelled of €300 shampoo. His other hand caressed her face with a tenderness that contrasted with the kiss's intensity, as if handling the finest porcelain. The entire cafe stopped breathing. Conversations cut off mid-sentence, forks suspended in air. Even the bartender forgot the coffee he was making, letting the milk burn with a whistling protest. When they finally separated, after what felt like simultaneously seconds and geological ages, Diego sat beside Carmen with the naturalness of someone who'd always occupied that place. He took her hand, intertwining their fingers with a familiarity that deceived even the regulars who'd seen her there every week, always alone, always unattainable. Rodrigo stared at them, jaw clenched so tight you could hear teeth grinding. His ski-tanned face from Baquera had taken on a sickly reddish hue. The veins in his neck pulsed like snakes beneath his skin. Diego turned to him with a smile that was pure challenge distilled into Castilian courtesy. He said nothing, but the message was clear: this woman is mine. Get lost. Carmen's hand trembled in his, but when Rodrigo tried to speak, she found her voice, transformed by the presence of this unexpected anchor. The confrontation that followed was brief but intense. Rodrigo tried to humiliate Diego, pointing at his apron, his workers' hands, the obvious social disparity. But Diego responded with a lethal calm born of having lost everything and having nothing left to fear. He spoke in perfect French, quoting Victor Hugo, switched to English to discuss Shakespeare, concluded in German with Goethe. Rodrigo's humiliation was total. He hadn't prepared for a waiter who spoke 3 languages and quoted classics. He hadn't prepared for a man who looked at him without fear, without reverence for his name or bank account. He left, slamming the door so hard the cups on the tables tinkled like alarm bells. Only then did Diego realize the entire cafe was staring at them. Well-dressed women with mouths open in shock, businessmen who'd forgotten their vitally important calls. Even the pianist had stopped playing, hands suspended over the ivory keys. Carmen looked at him as one might look at a miracle or a particularly vivid hallucination. Her perfect makeup was slightly smudged where he'd kissed her, giving her a vulnerable air that made her paradoxically more beautiful. She was still trembling, but now not just from fear. Something else was in her eyes, something unnamed but burning. The conversation that followed was whispered, intimate despite the audience. In halting words, Carmen explained 2 years of stalking, threats, a judicial system that couldn't touch him because his family owned half of Madrid. Diego listened, wiping away with a napkin a tear that had escaped her fierce control. He told his own story in fragments. Elena, an elementary school teacher, diagnosed with fulminant pancreatic cancer. The experimental treatments that cost everything they had and more. The death that came anyway, leaving him with crushing debts and a 6-year-old who asked why mommy wasn't coming back. 3 years of working 20-hour days, sleeping 4, also Lucia wouldn't notice they were poor, that they had nothing but each other. Carmen listened with an intensity Diego hadn't seen in anyone since Elena. When he finished, she made a decision that would change both their lives. She proposed an arrangement. She needed the fiction to continue, just until she could move to Barcelona, where she had an offer to expand her company. 3 months, maybe 4. She'd pay him 100,000 euros. Diego looked at her for a long time. 100,000 euros would mean salvation, pay off debts, a decent apartment for Lucia, maybe even a future. But there was something in Carmen's eyes, a loneliness he recognized, a pain mirroring his own. He didn't want her money like that. He proposed something different. A real job in the IT department. He'd learned programming at night, self-taught, trying to earn extra freelance money with hours that would let him see Lucia. Carmen accepted. They shook hands to seal the strangest pact in the history of fake relationships, but the handshake lasted a second longer than necessary, charged with unspoken electricity. The next day, Diego was summoned to the Mendoza Tower on Paseo de la Castellana. The glass elevator rose, revealing Madrid spreading beneath his feet like a three-dimensional map, but Diego only looked at his reflection in the mirrored walls, the janitor's uniform, the cart with cleaning products, the man he was and the man he'd been. Carmen's office occupied the entire 40th floor, 300 square meters of condensed power in glass and steel. She stood waiting by the window, Madrid at her feet like a conquered kingdom. The contrast with the terrified woman from the night before was absolute. The arrangement was formalized with surgical professionalism, a job in the IT department, with decent pay, flexible hours to care for Lucia, and the charade of being a couple at public events until she could leave Madrid. Neither mentioned the electric current that had passed between them during the kiss, nor the way their hands had fit together perfectly. Lucia met Carmen in El Retiro Park, neutral territory. The girl, with the premature wisdom of one who'd watched her mother die and her father cry in secret, studied this elegant woman who awkwardly tried to win her over with expensive ice cream and books unsuitable for her age. The interrogation Lucia subjected Carmen to was ruthless in its innocence. Why him specifically? What do you want with my dad? Is she like mom? Carmen responded with partial truths that Lucia accepted with the pragmatic philosophy of one who knows adults always lie a little. When Lucia took Carmen's hand to show her collection of Retiro stones, free treasures she collected because toys cost too much, something broke in the CEO's armored heart. She saw herself as a child, before the world hardened her, before Rodrigo destroyed her. Diego turned out to be a hidden programming genius. His code was poetry in algorithmic form, with comments that were haikus hidden among the functions. Colleagues looked at him with astonishment mixed with envy. How was it possible that the janitor programmed better than the Ivy League graduates on the team? The fiction with Carmen grew harder to maintain each day. Hands that sought each other out of habit, smiles that were no longer performed, conversations that continued beyond necessity, sliding into unasked for confessions about loneliness, pain, how you survive when the world has taken everything. One night, while working late on a real project, the inevitable happened. A kiss not for appearances, with no witnesses to deceive, just hunger and need. Two lonely souls recognizing each other in the darkness. They pulled apart, terrified by what they'd done, what it meant. Rodrigo escalated his obsession. Threatening letters sent to Lucia's school. Photos of Diego proving he was being followed. The message was clear: I can touch anyone you love. When Lucia came home from school with a black eye, she'd hit an older boy who'd called her father a gold digger. Diego made his decision. He reported everything to the national police, called El País, unleashed a media firestorm on Rodrigo Salazar. It was in this moment of chaos that Carmen revealed the truth that changed everything: she was pregnant. It was no longer fiction. Maybe it never had been. The positive pregnancy test trembled in her hands like a sentence, or a blessing, impossible to tell which. The trial against Rodrigo Salazar shook Madrid like a social earthquake. The untouchable heir to the real estate empire, handcuffed, photographed entering the courthouse at Plaza de Castilla with the look of someone who couldn't understand how the world had dared to rebel. Testimonies piled up like avalanches, other women he'd harassed, blackmailed, threatened. The castle of privilege built by generations crumbled in weeks of hearings. The 5-year sentence was met with applause in the courtroom. Rodrigo's mother, a Supreme Court judge, resigned the next day, her face a mask of shame poorly hidden behind sunglasses. The Salazar empire trembled, stocks plummeted. Newspapers talked for months about the scandal that had torn the veil of respectability from aristocratic Madrid. A year later, Café Gijon seemed from a kinder parallel dimension. The same golden light from the bohemian crystal chandeliers, the same marble tables, but the atmosphere was completely different. No longer a temple of appearances and power, but a place where a strange, beautiful family had found its balance. Diego sat at the same corner table where it had all begun, still wearing the waiter's apron he'd kept as a talisman. He no longer needed it, he'd become the CTO of Mendoza Tech with a salary that allowed much more than necessary. But he liked putting it on to remember where he came from, who he'd been, the courage of desperation that had led him to kiss a stranger. Carmen sat across from him, transformed by pregnancy into something luminous and soft. The 8th month had rounded not only her belly but also the sharp edges of her character. The ice queen who terrified boardrooms now laughed at Lucia's bad jokes, got emotional over kitten videos, ate ice cream straight from the tub at 3 a.m. Lucia, now 11, a master of origami and the affectionate manipulation of adults, was teaching Carmen how to make a paper crane. Her hands. Those same hands that had counted pennies in a piggy bank to help her dad, now created beauty with the confidence of one who knows she's loved, protected, safe. The moment arrived without warning, as all life-changing moments do. Carmen looked up from the half-finished origami and gazed at Diego with that intensity that even after a year still took his breath away. She spoke those 2 words they'd never dared say, as if saying them would make everything too real, too fragile, too perfect to last. I love you. Diego set down his coffee cup with slightly trembling hands. A year of shared life, of pretending it was still fiction when they already slept in the same bed, when Lucia called Carmen Aunt Carmen with a tone suggesting it would soon be something else, when the baby on the way already had a name and a room painted sky blue. The conversation that followed was a dance of half-told truths, veiled admissions, the reticence of wounded adults when they must admit they've found happiness. Diego confessed he'd loved her since that first kiss, the one meant to last 10 minutes but which had never really ended. Carmen admitted she'd started coming to Gijon long before that fateful night, that she'd watched him serve tables for weeks, fascinated by the grace of his movements, the kindness with which he treated even the most odious customers. Lucia, with the comic timing of children, interrupted by rolling her eyes and declaring all this romance was giving her cavities. But then she stood up and hugged them both, her thin arms trying to contain 2 adults and 1 unborn baby. An impossible family that had become the only possible one. The epilogue unfolded over the next 5 years like a tapestry woven from extraordinary everydayness. Mendoza Tech became Spain's first unicorn, valued at over €1 billion. Diego, from janitor to CTO, had become a legend in European Silicon Valley. His story, from mop bucket to code, inspired documentaries and TED Talks, but he still kept in his ultra-modern office the photo from when he cleaned bathrooms, to remind himself that humility is the price of wisdom. Lucia, now 16, a mathematical genius with scholarship offers from MIT and Complutense University, chose to stay in Madrid to finish high school, not from fear of leaving home, but because she had a boyfriend from the neighborhood who played guitar in a band. And she, pragmatic as always, knew some things were worth more than any prestigious university. Besides, she had to look after little brother Pablo, 5 years old, a tornado of energy with Carmen's honey-colored eyes and Diego's stubbornness. He terrorized the company daycare with experiments that invariably involved colored liquids and controlled explosions. His teachers adored and feared him in equal measure, seeing in him either a future genius or a future criminal, impossible to say which. During an interview for El País Semanal, the journalist asked Carmen the secret of her extraordinary success. The answer went viral, translated into 30 languages, printed on t-shirts, and cited in business schools worldwide. Carmen looked at Diego, who was at that moment teaching Pablo how to make soap bubbles with a chemically modified formula to make them stronger, fatherhood and science in one lesson. Lucia was photographing them for her Instagram, where she documented my family of adorable crazies for 100,000 teenage followers who saw in them proof that perfect families don't exist, but imperfect ones can be extraordinary. Carmen's answer was simple and devastating. I learned that pretending to be strong when you're weak makes you truly strong. That asking a stranger for help can save your life. That love isn't born perfect, but is built lie by lie until it becomes the most solid truth there is. Café Jean, riding the wave of the story turned urban legend, placed a golden plaque on the corner table. Here was born the love that didn't know it was love. Tourists lined up to photograph it. Couples reserved months in advance to sit where it all began. Revenue doubled. But the real magic happened each anniversary of that November night. Diego would put on his old apron, now more patches than original fabric, and serve Carmen a café con leche. She would look at him with the same terrified eyes as then, but now pretending, and whisper those words that had started everything, please, pretend you love me for 10 minutes. And he would answer each time, with different words but identical meaning, that he'd forgotten how to pretend. The kiss that followed still scandalized Jean, but now customers applauded. Lucia pretended to be disgusted but photographed everything. Pablo, who still didn't quite understand the story but knew it was important, clapped with hands covered in whatever he'd eaten or touched that day. One night, while putting Pablo to bed, he was asking for the umpteenth time for the story of how they met, the obviously sugar-coated version. Diego told Carmen something he'd never said before. That night, when he'd first kissed her, for a moment he'd seen Elena, not in her face or body, but in her soul. And he'd understood that Elena had sent him there, to that cafe at that precise moment, to save them both. Carmen cried, but they were good tears, the kind that cleanse instead of stain. She confessed that she too had felt something supernatural in that kiss, as if the universe had conspired to make them meet. Two broken pieces that together formed something whole. The story of the CEO and the waiter became a case study in psychology departments. How can love born of fear and lies become so solid? Professors wrote papers, students wrote theses, the answers were multiple and none entirely satisfying. But Lucia, with the wisdom of her 16 years, had the best theory. True love, she'd tell anyone who'd listen, isn't the one that starts perfect. It's the one that starts as a desperate lie, whispered to a stranger, and becomes the most important truth of your life. It's my dad, cleaning bathrooms by day and speaking 3 languages by night. It's Carmen commanding an empire but unable to make an origami crane. It's Pablo breaking everything he touches but then hugging you with sticky little hands, and the world clicks back into place. The final image of this story is a photo Lucia posted on Instagram the night of her 16th birthday. The caption read simply, "My family started with a lie and continues with the truth." In the photo, Diego, with still some traces of detergent on his expensive jeans, Carmen, with a splash of gazpacho on her silk blouse, Pablo, face covered in chocolate cake, and her, Lucia, in the center, holding them all together as she always had since she was 9 years old and put her savings in a piggy bank to help her dad. In the background, through the window, Café Jean glowed in the Madrid night, and on a small, nearly invisible table, a perfect origami crane, one Carmen had finally learned to make. The love born from 10 minutes of fiction had become a lifetime of truth. And it continued. If this story moved you, if you held your breath during the unexpected twists, if you believed that love can be born even from desperation, leave a like to support stories showing how real life surpasses any fiction. Comment which moment impacted you most. Share with someone who needs to believe that love always finds its way. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that will keep you glued until the last word. Remember, sometimes the greatest truths are born from the most desperate lies, and the love you pretend can become the love that saves. Have you ever pretended something that later became real? Tell us in the comments. M.